If you evaluate the number of people that are fed per acre by the agricultural systems of different countries of the world, one result that you see illustrated here, the student's name is Emily Cassidy. Emily illustrated that if you ask that question and measured it by the number of calories that are produced per hectare, you get the result that you would expect. U.S. agriculture is very productive. It is very muscular. You know, the steroids that I referred to are basically the power that we have to appropriate fossil fuel, water, nutrients to land, everything that I described. We're very powerful that way. We fought wars in order to make sure that we can assert that agricultural power. However, if you vary that question to the more germane question, which is, how many people do you feed per acre? Then the results transform. Then it turns out that the United States is actually below the world average, and that we barely feed 5 people per hectare, and China feeds 8 people per hectare. So it leads to the following question: how efficient are each of those systems? Remember, that's one of the conceits of the global agribusiness system, that it's very efficient. But when you ask that question, it turns out that a country like India is the single most efficient. It's almost off the charts. 91% efficient in delivering food calories to people, and that the United States has a lot to be embarrassed about. 34% efficient in terms of calories delivered as food per people. I want to be fair to this analysis and tell you the explanation is obvious. You know it, and so let me just show it to you. The explanation is that we don't produce food on the majority of agriculture acres. We don't intend, we don't mean to. We don't set out to produce food on the majority of agriculture acres. We know how to produce a lot, so we're producing something, and we're looking at markets for what we can produce. But the footprint of the food component is very, very small. These are Economic Research Service data. What you can see here is that the majority of what we produce is feed and residual use, alcohol for biofuels, which has become very important in the 2000s, and then you almost rarely see that upper fraction of this graph. You actually have to mean to go look for it. The teeny proportion of agricultural output, which is actually food, that's how much we overproduce. The major problem that the agricultural sector has, not the agribusiness sector, the agricultural sector that provides the raw inputs for the agribusiness sector, because that's how farmers are to the agribusiness sector, they just provide inputs. So that contribution is so teeny small that you actually have to make a special effort to go and find out how much that is. Here it's actually aggregated. It's not just the food. It's food, seed, and industrial uses. It shows up on your food packaging looking like citric acid, for instance. So now, the reason why I said that I wanted to be fair to everyone, and this is very important, particularly for those of you that farm in the audience. It is a very legitimate thing to say. If we're overproducing, and let me finish that thought, I realized I didn't. The single biggest problem of the agricultural sector is overproduction, which drives down prices. The agribusiness sector benefits from that, but not farmers. But farmers have only that one tool to respond to any challenge. If prices are low, they have to produce a lot to compensate for low price. If prices are high, they want to produce a lot to take advantage of the high price. It's the only thing that you can do, try to produce as much as possible under each of those two circumstances. So we overproduce, and we have policies in place to help people overcome disasters, whether it's market disasters or natural disasters, and so we overproduce. Every signal says overproduce. So it drives down prices, it facilitates the operation of the system that I just described. So there are folks that benefit from the system. All of us in this room are beneficiaries of this system, but that agribusiness sector, for which low prices that result from surpluses are a requirement, also benefits. Here's what I meant to say for those of you that are farmers. It's a legitimate thing to say, okay, if we're overproducing and we either need to pull back or produce something different, what are those of us that are in the excess capacity going to do? When farmers here talk like this, all they're hearing is, you don't support me, you don't support farmers. So I want to make this point clear. It's a legitimate thing to say, then what will those farmers do? That's a legitimate research question. We've created land-grant universities in the public interest to pursue just questions like that, but right now they're not. They'd like to pursue other questions. There's feedback loops that we're not going to talk about in this session. But it is important not to conflate, for all the reasons that I've described here, that a population of farmers that on the whole is not producing food should say that they're feeding the planet. As a matter of fact, if you just want to test this proposition for yourself, go to the Farm Bureau website where they will tell you how many farmers or how many people every U.S. farmer feeds. They come up with those figures rigorously. They actually compute how much is produced, how much is exported, which is a loss, and how much is imported. So they calculate the differential for just what is produced in the United States, divide by the population of the United States, and they say that's how many people are fed. But they've actually had that formalized now by the USDA, so the Economic Research Service does that calculation every year. By that number, you'll have to check me, but it'll be in the neighborhood of about 176 people per farmer. You can just multiply that by the 2.1 to 2.3 million farmers that there are, and the product of that multiplication will tell you that U.S. farmers feed the U.S. population, yes, and about 2 or 3 other countries of about 10 million population. So it's not feeding the world. You know, it's a bald exaggeration. It's fair to say we're very productive. It's fair to say that if all the acreage that we're not going into industrial uses were put into food, that we could produce more. But the majority of the food that is produced in the world is consumed right where it's produced. Only about 20% of agricultural output goes into the global trade market. So those are important things to understand, but they are beneficiaries to the system. And here's something that Bastiat said about a situation like this. Whenever plunder, remember what Benjamin Franklin said, that's agriculture, becomes a way of life for a group of men in a society, sadly, I think men is quite appropriate there if you remember the story that I just told you, over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. So you hear all that glorifying language about how great the system is. This is almost like the doxology. If you go to a meeting of agricultural scientists or anybody in the agribusiness sector, sooner or later in a keynote talk, you'll hear the doxology. And it is the United States, because of its investments, has produced the safest, cheapest, most abundant supply of food in the world. You all have heard that any number of times. So that's what Bastiat is referring to here. Now, we're in New York State, and so I'm bound to show you how this is actually manifested. The New York State Farm Bureau, at a meeting 2 falls ago, basically had this as their placemat. Just to underscore what I told you about 30 minutes ago, the features of the system are intentional. They are not incidental. So remember all of the issues that I've essentially inventoried for you here? On each placemat, the Farm Bureau had for its members this. The top stops in the 2015 legislative session. No new minimum wage increases. No mandatory GMO labeling. No omnibus farm worker labor bill. Rights of farmers are just fine. No movement of animal cruelty laws out of the Department of Agriculture and Markets, because that's where their buddies make their rules. They have protection there. No changes to animal care standards. They're not based on proven scientific standards. And no expiration of 2% property tax cap. By the way, I don't need to expand on that next to last, but you know, I'm a scientist, and many of you in the room are. The scientific standards is pure hope in there. Essentially what it means is that we only want to consider how fast an animal is gaining weight. Nothing else matters, because that you can measure very easily. But whether you're treating the animal humanely or any other aspect of that, you're excluding, don't want anything written said about. So we're not imagining the features that I've described to you. There are organizations, very powerful organizations, working actively for what I've just described. If you're in the audience and you're a farmer and you're a member of the Farm Bureau, or if you're not a farmer but you buy Farm Bureau insurance, remember that you're a member of an organization that is very powerful. You have a responsibility to do something about what you see up on the screen right now. So, Bastiat said we will create a system that will benefit us. This is what it looks like. It is made mostly of millionaires in the United States. You know that's no exaggeration. Let me show you what agribusiness lobbying looks like. Now, Bastiat said whenever a group of men finds that a system of plunder benefits them, they will put in place practices and policies that will preserve it in the language that glorifies that. So that describes Congress. And here's the lobbying that makes sure that the feedback loop is not one that responds to you. Your representatives are not representative of you. It responds to this lobbying. this is just agribusiness lobbying, but you can see that it averages about 120 million a year since about 2008, and it bumps every time that there's a farm bill year, so we can expect this coming year that it's going to bump. Now, just for you to compare, because these are just so many numbers that they may not, you have to have some sort of standard to evaluate. That's commensurate with what the defense lobby is. One of the most powerful lobbies that there is in DC. Furthermore, let me tell you this. Your votes, for reasons that I'll show you here in just a little bit, have very little influence on the decisions that these folks make. But lobbying is probably one of the most remunerative propositions that organizations have, and I want to show you this figure before I actually justify this to you. So this is a complex study. Let me just read to you, because I noticed that with the slide here you can't actually see the citation. If you want to go look at this study, it's a very fun study by Gillens and Page, political scientists from Princeton. It's in Perspective in Politics from the year 2014. What they did was this. Over a period of 18 years, they compiled all of the decisions that the federal Congress made, and then made a subjective decision about which sector of the economy divided into quintiles would benefit the most if Congress approved that particular measure. And so the graph that you see here shows you that unequivocally, the more these policies that they passed, these were almost 20,000 policies over 18,000 years that they examined, the more that they benefit quintiles 4 and 5, in other words, the wealthiest sector in society, people like you and I in this room, the more likely Congress is to pass those laws. So, here are the folks that actually conditioned that. Rather than you as the folks that put them in office, your representatives are responding to the signals and the wishes that the top 10 lobbyists in the agribusiness sector make. And here's why they do it. This is what I was going to tell you. The return on investment for federal lobbying. Now, you know that if you were in the stock market and you get a return right now of 12%, 16%, you're either, depending on who you are, telling everybody or you're keeping it to yourself. The return to federal lobbying, according to the Sunshine Foundation, it's an Open Secrets website that you can go to, is 176,000%. That's why they do it. Very effective. Now remember the figures that I mentioned. $250 million investment spread across the entire agribusiness sector. It's lint. They don't even feel it. And yet look at their returns. So they can't be blamed for doing that. So what is the little union of concerned scientists going to be doing about the situation that I described to you, the simple little situation that I described to you? So we're 180 people. We basically are supported by our membership, a little bit over 500,000 people. We'll take your contributions for sure, but we don't require a contribution. You can just tell us you care about our issues, which are climate change and alternative fuels, the threat of nuclear war, scientific integrity, and the food system. If you care about those issues, and particularly if you care about issues of social equity, which are the lens that we apply to everything, you can become a member. Again, we'll take your contributions. The majority of our money comes from our members. That's actually our strength. Because we don't take money from the government. We don't take money from corporations. That's why I can be playing with you. I don't need to worry what someone's going to think when they hear that Ricardo said this or that. And that applies to my 179 colleagues. And the food system, because this is not a simple nut to crack, we've got a strategy that has several different components. Now, I don't want to lead you on here. There is a certain aspect of you don't reveal your playbook in public, right? But there are some things that I will share with you. And so let me share with you, while we talk about the way that at least I think about the food system, the context. Actually, Joan Gelsau gave me a nice explanation in the reception just before here, the cognitive context for the way in which we operate here. And it is that any system is a set of parts that operate in coordination in order to produce a given end. Now, the thing is that per the articulation of Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of our foremost scientists, physics is easy because it's linear. But the moment you insert people into any system, the system goes nonlinear which is why physics is easy and sociology is hard. And the system that I just described to you is definitely a social system. Remember, my first words to you were, this is a system about power. So, this system with that complex dynamics that I described to you can actually be explained in lots of different ways. And so let me just illustrate that for you with 2 or 3 examples. I think you'll immediately get the notion. So, if you are a farmer in the Midwest, you can look at the likes of me, you can put up with me for an hour, and then you can stand up and you'll be taller than I am. I've been in the situation, and you look down at me and you'll say, young man, actually you won't say that part anymore, but you'll say, we are some of the most productive business people on the planet. And the way that they experience the food system, they know that if they didn't do what they did, that all of the grain elevators would be empty and that all of the grain processors would be out of business in the Midwest. They see themselves as an essential cog in the way that the global agribusiness system works. So when you talk about some of the issues that I described right now, they don't see it. So you ask them to describe what is the system that you work with, what is the set of parts working in coordination to produce a particular end. The end, they would say, is to produce as much food as possible. We're feeding the world. That's what Midwestern farmers will tell you. Now, here's another interpretation. This is one of the most efficient systems that humanity has ever devised to remove topsoil from the upper Mississippi watershed and deliver it to the Gulf Coast. Objectively, that is a true statement. If we had to do that with mechanical shovels and trucks and conveyor belts and so on, it would be almost an impossible proposition. And so, there's another definition of the system just as true. How about this one? This is more to the core of what I just been arguing to you. This is a system that very effectively displaces farmers in southern Mexico and Central America and concentrates them around meat packing plants in the Midwest. That story has to do with the North American Free Trade Agreement, displacement of 2 million farmers in southern Mexico and North Central America. So you can see that the food system is a soft system, like Neil deGrasse Tyson describes, a non-linear system, has a great deal of subjectivity in terms of which parts of it you would like to see and what objective you would like to ascribe to the system. So you can't just approach the system like the high and mighty Union of Concerned Scientists and say, what problem are we going to solve here and how are we going to do that? There's nothing to fix by itself. There are a lot of things to improve. There are a lot of things that we can iterate on. There is no simple fix to the confluence of factors that add up to the system, many of which are just about the worldview that we apply to this. Remember, if we're descendants of colonists, we have a completely different view and language that we use to talk about this system. Okay, I see Laureen wants to spare you the agony, and so I should wrap this up really quickly. So let me just do this by very quickly running down a list that was put together by one of the planet's recent geniuses, who unfortunately is no longer with us, Danila Meadows, who established, among other things, the Sustainability Institute in Vermont. But because I have gone on so long, I just want to give you the punchline of this. She made this observation. If the system you're trying to fix is a hard system, you know, what Neil deGrasse Tyson calls a linear physical system, that's a relatively simple proposition. You engage with that system at what's called a leverage point. So you make an intervention at one point that has disproportionate effects on the whole system. Here's an example. Walk into a clock repair shop with your broken watch, a mechanical watch. Watch has something broken with it, a spring or a gear. It's one of the two things that it can be. The competent repair person looks at it and says, this is the gear that is worn down. This is what you need to replace. Repeat that 9 times. 10 different clock repair people, competent craftspeople, will identify the same thing that's wrong, will tell you the same thing you need to do to fix it. That's a hard system. If your car goes flat, same thing operates. If the food system is going wrong, I've argued for, ad infinitum that the system is going wrong, there's no single gear you can go to intervene. Now, what she said about systems like this is that the higher up the hierarchy of intervention you go, which confoundingly here's from top to bottom here, the more powerful the intervention is. In other words, if we had the power to transcend the way that we think that agriculture is, if we get beyond thinking that it's about my investment in tractors and seasoning to maximize my profit and so on, and I don't care how I got the land, if those people are just unfortunate people elsewhere, if you have the money to buy, then welcome, if you don't, you're not my problem. That paradigm that we're in right now, if we could change that to the broader type of understanding that I've shared with you, which is not particular to me, it's just basically sharing with you what anthropologists, sociologists, economists, and a whole aggregate of people, Basquiat, Franklin, I've been quoting you all these people, but they've all concluded that the food system actually is. So if we could do that, that would be powerful. But can you imagine me walking into Congress and saying, Senator, we need to change our paradigm about food. The senator may be, Gillibrand, she may be completely sympathetic, but I give her nothing to do. She can't do anything with that. So we need to go farther down to less powerful ways of intervening. So the Union of Concerned Scientists right now is attempting to work at the level that says the rules of the system, what the incentives, punishments, and constraints are, otherwise known as policies. Fully cognizant that there's all other places where we can intervene, and happy that other organizations are doing that kind of work. We were, up until this administration was elected, on a pretty good course in advocating for what we were calling a national policy for food, health, and well-being. In other words, connecting all of the disparate parts of the food system. Health is related to the way in which we eat. What we eat is related to what we produce. What we produce is related to the policy and market incentives that are out there. We can't expect that system to perform differently than it is performing right now unless we actually change paradigms. We do accept that, but we can operate at a lower level of intervention by giving completely different incentives than the ones that exist right now. I've explained why all of those incentives aren't produce as much as you can. So this is what we were attempting to do. But the new administration forces us to change our thinking because we would have had a cooperative administration, a sympathetic administration. We were in conversations with the transition team. But now we have an administration that is essentially captured by this particular sector. Now, I don't want to demonize that this is just a very handy way, sort of in shorthand, identifying who they are. And our problem is this, that your friend and mine, Michael Pollan, in an article from last fall, very accurately said, the likes of us don't have any kind of political power to do anything about this. Farm Bureau has power, the agribusiness sector has power in this world, the commodity and trade associations, they have power in this world. The likes of us in this room have no political power. So he just honestly pointed that out to us, and so we have a project to attempt to do this, and it is a long-term project of necessity. But it is building up grassroots, organized, intentional efforts, and an alliance that we're calling the Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor Alliance. These are the anchor team members here. You may know some of them. Now, I'll list them for you because I have to. It's part of the values that we have whenever we each go around talking about this. For the reasons I just spent your patience talking about, it is really important who these anchor organizations are working to build up the political power of the food movement to transform it so that we can have leverage and be at the table when some of these other organizations are there. So beginning from your right, we have Dara Cooper, who is working with the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. Then Jose Oliva, who's the co-founder and co-executive director of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. Then you have Anim Steele with the Real Food Challenge. My colleague Amelia Moore, to your farthest left, and myself are just giddy that these people are in our offices in DC. And the last individual up front on the left is Navina Khanna, who's the director of the HEAL Food Alliance, and she's with the Movement Strategy Center, whose specialty is thinking about building the power of movements. So here's what the strategy is. And remember, we have to speak at very high level and keep some of the plays in the playbook to ourselves. But here's the general idea. We need crushers of this big system. So one of the crushers I've described to you already is to build political power. Another of the crushers is to have a very concrete goal that we're aiming for. I described it to you, a coherent national policy for food, health, and well-being. We always need to remember the following. I've always believed you won't be successful in transforming a system and improving conditions in getting practices replaced if you're full of hot air. The only thing that is going to be ultimately persuasive in replacing something that is worse is to have something better. We really do need to have the goods in terms of answering the question, are there other methods to produce that are just as productive, that can be profitable to farmers, that can clean water, that can clean air, that can retain soil in place, that don't exploit labor? We need to have the analysis that demonstrates what those alternatives are, and if you go to our website and read the analyses that we do, they're all designed to answer those questions. So if it were just a matter of the knowledge that we have sufficient knowledge. But knowledge is insufficient. That's why the political power needs to be built. So all of these need to be worked together. We need to expose the opposition. I've talked about the Farm Bureau approach due to the fact that I've overstayed my welcome. I'm not going to elaborate that, but there is a concrete opposition that we need to work with. You should know that one way of doing this soft systems work is to work with all of the stakeholders and get everyone to agree what new condition of the system we want, and agree who's going to do what and in what sequence, and iterate on that. That would mean, in our case, the Unit of Concerned Scientist works with eaters, works with the agribusiness sector, works with farmer organizations, works with policymakers. We all agree what the desirable condition is, and we all begin to act differently to come up with a different reality. We don't think that's a realistic scenario. Thereby, I come again for the third time to say political power. We either have to be smarter, we're not that conceited, or we have to have political power. So that's why we're building political power. And we need to have working examples. So all of these have names. So the Building Political Power is the Heal Food Alliance. I already talked about our advocacy for a national food policy. You can go on our website and read all these different analyses. The Farm Bureau is the nicest proxy for what the opposition is, giving you just one trite example of why that is. And our example of something that works better, you can Google, is the Good Food Purchasing Plan. This leverages dollars that are already going to be spent. The beauty of it is you don't have to make an argument to spend more money, to tax anybody. Municipalities and institutions spend millions of dollars every year to provide food to either their clients or their staff. And if they agree to the standards of the Good Food Purchasing Program, when they expend those dollars, they will not exploit people or nature and provide nourishing food and livelihood for farmers. You can read about it online if you go to the website of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. So these are the parallel pieces of work that we're doing in order to deal with this. And we're bundling all of this in 3 different working groups. I really will be considerate in not going through each of these, but the one that probably requires some explanation is the Clean Corporations Working Group. We debated a lot what to call this. At first it was an anti-agribusiness sector. But we see that there are entrepreneurs and business people out there that are trying to innovate and do things differently. So we need to have the space where we can champion them and elevate them and say, yes, this is an example of the sorts of things that we want to see happening. The Political Leadership Working Group has come up with the idea that we need different political leadership with different standards of integrity and different purposes for public life. And they said we need to provide them training, we need to train their campaign managers, we need to raise funds for them, and so they proposed creating a Political Leadership Institute. It's going to start out this fall. We are just finalizing the hire for the director of that Political Leadership Institute. The first class is going to start, again, as I said, this fall. So I think I've delivered myself of everything that I need to say to you here, and if you want to learn more about what we do, there's the URL. If you want to learn more about the Heal Food Alliance, there's their URL, and if you want to communicate with me directly, there's my Twitter address. And I want to thank Fred deeply for the opportunity to be here to speak with you, and all of you for your patience and forbearance. Thank you very much, Jill.